I am Helen Carter, and I am 64 years old. For nearly 2 decades, I've run a recovery center for women in upstate Massachusetts. It sits quietly on a hill, the brick walls weathered by time, once home to a convent. Every morning, I walk its halls in the soft light, remembering the nights when I slept in my car behind a liquor store, wondering if I'd ever see a better life. Now, my hands no longer shake. My mind feels clear, and I find purpose in helping others climb out of the darkness I once lived in. My son, Matthew, is 32. He's grown into a man I barely recognize. A doctor now living in Boston. Our conversations are brief, clipped by distance and responsibility. I've always known he was serious about someone when his calls grew short. And he mentioned a woman named Olivia. He spoke of her family old money from Connecticut. Private. Polished. Perfect. I smiled, though I sensed the pauses in his voice were holding back pieces of the story. I didn't ask for photos. I didn't insist on visits. I simply wanted him to be happy. The wedding invitation arrived like an afterthought, printed on heavy cream paper, names pressed in gold. It was addressed to me as a guest of the groom, a subtle reminder that I wasn't part of the family proper. A note requested I refrain from bringing anyone from the center, citing a very exclusive guest list. I held that slip of paper at my kitchen table, feeling a familiar pinch of old shame. For a moment, I considered shrinking away, letting their expectations dictate my presence. But I reminded myself that shame had no place in the life I had built. I wrote Matthew a letter instead of calling, words flowing slowly, deliberate. I told him how proud I was, how much I loved him, how I wanted his day to be beautiful. I promised to be there quietly, wherever they seated me. I didn't ask for acknowledgement or fairness. I only asked that he remember that I would always be in his corner, even when distance and circumstance made it feel otherwise. That night, I sat on the porch of the center, watching the valley lights twinkle beneath the dark sky. The scent of pine and rain drifted upward, carrying a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. I knew then that attending the wedding would not be about proving anything. It would be about showing up with dignity, quietly holding space for the truth, and preparing myself for whatever surprises might lie ahead. Little did I know, the surprises waiting at that vineyard would challenge everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family. The next few days would pull me into a story far more complicated than any invitation could have hinted, and I could only brace myself, heart open, for what was coming. Do you want me to continue now with part 2, backstory and emotional investment? I've come a long way from the woman I used to be. There was a time when my nights were filled with fear and shame, when my only company was the cold seat of my car and the hum of streetlights outside. I would tell myself I didn't belong anywhere, that I had no right to happiness. Those years taught me what desperation feels like, and eventually, what resilience requires. Recovery wasn't just about giving up the bottle, it was about reclaiming myself, piece by piece, hand by hand. Running this recovery center became my anchor. The old brick building, once a convent, now holds stories of women who, like me, fought to rise from the lowest points of their lives. I remember every name, every struggle, every tear that turned into a small, courageous smile. Watching them stand tall after months of therapy reminds me of my own journey. It's quiet work, but it matters. Every hug, every word of encouragement, is a victory I carry home with me at night. And then there's Matthew. I raised him almost entirely on my own after his father passed, and I poured everything I had into giving him a foundation stronger than I ever had. I watched him grow from a curious boy with a baseball glove into a man in a white coat, a doctor whose life pulled him far from our little home in Massachusetts. He calls less these days, speaks in careful tones, and tells me about Olivia in a way that feels like he's measuring every word. I smile on the outside, but inside I feel the gentle tug of distance. The bittersweet ache of being proud and yet somehow invisible. When the wedding plans began to surface, I felt a quiet stir of anticipation mixed with unease. The invitations arrived, lavish and pristine, but subtle in the way they addressed me as simply a guest of the groom. No family acknowledgement. No hint of inclusion beyond courtesy. Even then, I reminded myself to stay calm, to take the high road. I wrote Matthew a letter rather than call, choosing words that offered love without complaint. I promised to be present, quietly and with dignity. Regardless of where I was seated or how I might be perceived, I wanted him to enjoy his day without my hurt shadowing it. Even as I wrote that letter, memories flooded me, the mornings spent helping Matthew with homework. The nights when I tiptoed around the house so he could sleep soundly while I wrestled with my own demons. Those moments built a bond deeper than appearances or social niceties could ever touch. And yet, there was that small flicker of apprehension, a whisper that not everything about this wedding felt right. Something about Olivia's story, the perfection her family projected, left me uneasy. I told myself it might be nothing, just nerves. But a small voice inside me wondered if pride and money might be masking truths I couldn't yet see. As I folded the letter and placed it in the envelope, I felt a calm resolve settle over me. I had made my choice to show up, to honor my son, and to carry myself with dignity. The coming days would test that resolve in ways I couldn't yet imagine. I could only prepare my heart, steady my mind, and remain vigilant, knowing that the quiet life I'd built and the love I bore for my son might be the only armor I had for the surprises ahead. The air smelled faintly of pine that night as I walked the center's porch, and I let myself breathe in the calm. Whatever lay ahead at that vineyard, I would face it the way I've faced everything else, slowly, deliberately, and with the certainty that I was standing on solid ground, no matter how shaky the world around me felt. A week before the wedding, I ran into an old friend from the recovery community at a small thrift shop in town. She had once stayed at a center in Arizona and, in a quiet, almost hesitant way, mentioned she thought she recognized Olivia from her past. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it must be a coincidence, but her words lingered long after she left. The kind of detail that refuses to settle quietly in your mind. I couldn't help replaying every interaction I'd had with Olivia. Every story she'd told about her family. Everything had seemed polished, rehearsed, too perfect. The pauses in Matthew's descriptions of her parents now made a small, gnawing sense of unease bloom in my chest. I realized I hadn't asked to meet them, hadn't seen any old family photos, and the social media accounts she claimed were hers had little history. Something was off. That night, I sat at my desk in the center. The hallway, quiet, except for the faint scent of disinfectant and coffee. I opened my laptop and began searching. I combed through public records, news articles, and social media posts. I reached out discreetly to a couple of colleagues who worked in medical licensing, asking if the name Olivia had ever appeared under a different alias. It felt strange, almost like walking in a dark room with only a candle for light. Shapes shifted, some familiar, some alien, and I had to force myself to stay calm. I reminded myself that I wasn't trying to catch someone, I was trying to protect my son from being blindsided. Yet each detail I uncovered tightened the knot in my stomach. Photos of Olivia at charity events looked carefully posed, recent, and lacking depth. She seemed to exist only in the curated moments she wanted the world to see. The idea that her family might be nothing more than actors, hired to create a facade of wealth and stability. I started to feel less like suspicion and more like a possibility I couldn't ignore. At the rehearsal dinner, the unease crystallized into something sharper. Olivia's words, sharp with derision, called my work a junkyard for addicts. The laughter that followed didn't reach her eyes, and I felt a flash of old anger, the kind that is both fierce and sorrowful. I folded my hands in my lap and let the comment pass through me, but it lingered like a hammer on glass. In that moment, I realized that this was more than social snubbing. It was a deliberate attempt to diminish the life I had built, to make me feel small. I knew then that the wedding wouldn't just be a celebration, it would be a stage, and I had to decide how I would play my part. I didn't want to be seen as confrontational or vindictive. I wanted to be a guardian of truth, a quiet presence who could stand steady when illusions fell apart. I thought of Matthew as a boy, trusting me to protect him, and I vowed I would do the same for him now, even if it meant standing alone. As I turned off the desk lamp that night, I felt a strange mixture of dread and resolve. The calm I had cultivated over years of recovery would be tested in ways I hadn't yet imagined. The days ahead promised tension, confrontation, and, perhaps, revelation. I allowed myself one deep breath, thinking that sometimes protecting the ones you love requires patience, courage, and the quiet gathering of truths before the storm. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, with sunlight spilling over the vineyard rows like a promise I wasn't sure I was ready to keep. I wore a navy dress I had owned for years. Simple, comfortable, and dignified. I arrived early, wanting to take it all in quietly before the crowd gathered. The setting was perfect, almost painfully, so white ribbons fluttered in the breeze. Flowers gleamed in the soft gold light, and every detail had been meticulously arranged. Matthew greeted me with a brief hug, almost apologetics, and then disappeared into a circle of groomsmen. I took my seat near the back, close enough to see him, but far enough to be invisible to the others. Guests moved with an air of elegance I had rarely experienced. I watched Olivia glide through the crowd, her laughter light but rehearsed. Her family, or what she presented as family, orbiting her like a carefully constructed halo. She barely acknowledged me. And for a moment, old doubts began to stir. I remembered my old friend's words from the thrift store, the fleeting recognition, and I felt that familiar knot tighten in my chest. Could it really be that everything Olivia had built around her life was a carefully constructed illusion? Each smile she offered, each small gesture, suddenly felt rehearsed. I felt a pang of sorrow for Matthew, for the son who deserved to step into a marriage grounded in truth. I thought back to the boy I had tucked into bed, the boy who trusted me to guide him, and I knew I had to act, but quietly, carefully. I found a moment to slip away, under the pretense of checking my purse, and sent a discreet message to an old colleague who had once worked in rehab with Olivia. The contact promised to help, to verify if the details I suspected were true, but warned it might take time. Waiting. I felt the strange mix of anxiety and resolve. This was more than a wedding now, it was a test of patience, vigilance, and integrity. I reflected on the years of rebuilding my life. The discipline it had taken to stay sober and strong, that discipline would guide me now. During the rehearsal dinner, the tension became almost tangible. Olivia made a pointed remark about my work at the center, laughing in a way that cut deeper than she could have known. I held my hands folded in my lap, choosing not to react outwardly, focusing instead on the faces of the women I had helped over the years, on every life I had touched and transformed. I reminded myself that their worth, and mine, could not be diminished by a single cruel word. I realized then that Matthew was walking into a world built on lies, a world that could easily blind him to reality. And in that quiet moment, I made a decision. I would reveal the truth in a way that protected him, that respected him, and yet did not allow deception to take root. The anticipation, the careful planning, the waiting for the right moment, it all became part of a delicate strategy to prevent harm without shaming anyone unnecessarily. I felt the energy of the vineyard shift, the quiet undercurrent of tension threading through the laughter, music, and clinking glasses. Every glance I shared with Matthew was loaded with unspoken concern. Every movement, every breath, carried the weight of what I knew might soon unfold. I reminded myself that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's a calm, steady presence, a silent readiness to act when truth and love demand it. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, I had gathered all the fragments, quietly verified what I could, and braced myself for the moment when illusion would meet reality. I knew that when the revelation came, it would change everything, but I also knew that standing firm in truth, in integrity, was the only way to protect the ones I loved most. The stage was set, the pieces in place, and the next act of this story would soon unfold in a way no one could have predicted. The day of the wedding felt surreal. The vineyard bathed in a soft golden light that made everything look like a painting. I took my usual quiet seat near the back, clutching my purse a little tighter than usual, bracing myself for the moment when truth would collide with illusion. Matthew moved about nervously, his excitement mixed with that subtle tension I recognized as him sensing something was off, even if he couldn't name it. Olivia arrived, radiant and confident, her family, or the actors posing as them, flanking her perfectly. Every smile, every gesture was polished, rehearsed, and, in that light, faintly unnatural, I felt a pang of sorrow for my son, the boy who had trusted me implicitly, and I knew I had to protect him from a life built on deception. My hands hovered over my phone as I sent one final, discreet message to Richard, the colleague who had worked with Olivia years ago. I reminded myself that I wasn't seeking revenge, I was safeguarding truth. As the ceremony began, I observed quietly, taking in the meticulous arrangements, the soft strains of the violin, and the expectant faces of the guests. And then, subtly, Richard moved through the crowd, unseen by most, and spoke with Matthew just behind a row of trees. I watched from a distance, my heart pounding. As he quietly relayed the information I had pieced together, Olivia had stayed at a rehab facility under a different name, and the people posing as her family were hired actors. He handed Matthew a photograph from the old records. I saw his face stiffen. A single nod, a silent acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. The ceremony continued, but the air had changed. Olivia reached for her purse, and when it fell, 2 small pill bottles rolled to Matthew's feet. The moment was quiet but seismic. Every carefully constructed illusion trembled in that single instant. I stood slowly, my presence deliberate but not confrontational. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I let her see me. The reality of someone who had chosen integrity, love, and protection over pride or anger. I reminded myself that Matthew needed the truth more than he needed a perfect wedding day. Watching Olivia's smile falter, seeing the confusion flicker across her face, I realized that revelation doesn't always need drama to be devastating. Sometimes, it's quiet. It's patient. It simply waits for the right moment to reveal itself. The guests murmured, some sensing that something profound had just occurred, even if they didn't yet understand the details. I walked back down the aisle, not in triumph, but in measured sadness. This wasn't about victory, it was about truth. About preventing a life built on lies from taking root. I reminded myself that sometimes protection means interruption, and sometimes love means standing firm even when it hurts. Matthew didn't speak immediately. He needed time, space, and understanding to process the revelation. And I accepted that. My presence, steady and unwavering, was enough. I reminded myself of all the lessons I had learned in my life: resilience, patience, and the power of integrity. Olivia, shaken but not defeated, would eventually have to confront her own truths. And my son, though temporarily stunned, had the chance to step into a marriage rooted in reality, not performance. As I returned to my seat, the sun slanting through the vineyard trees, I felt the quiet shift in the air. Truth had been spoken without malice. Love had been preserved without compromise. And the stage, though disrupted, now offered a chance for honesty to take its place. I realized that integrity often feels heavy in the moment, but it leaves the soul lighter. And it was that weightless certainty I carried with me as the ceremony continued, forever altered, yet still full of possibility. After the chaos of the ceremony, I watched as Olivia slowly gathered herself, the layers of her carefully constructed persona peeling away. She approached the center in the days that followed, hesitant, carrying the weight of her choices. She wasn't there to justify herself or to demand forgiveness. She was there because she wanted to understand how to become someone better, someone capable of honesty and connection. I saw in her eyes a vulnerability that mirrored the one I had once known in myself. She began to help at the center, quietly taking on tasks, sorting donations, painting new rooms, organizing supplies. She asked questions, listened intently, and offered help without seeking praise. I watched her interact with the women who had once inspired me, seeing the first genuine glimpses of a person willing to shed the masks that had kept her safe but isolated. There was no sudden redemption, no grand proclamation. It was simple, steady progress, measured in the way she showed up, day by day. Matthew, my son, took time to process everything. His calls grew longer, filled with questions, and slowly, he began to recognize the depth of what I had tried to protect him from. I could feel him reflecting on the choices that nearly led him into a life built on deception. And even though the wedding had ended in disappointment and disruption, I knew that exposing the truth had given him something far more valuable than a perfect day. It had given him clarity, a chance to build his future on honesty. I found myself reflecting on the years I had spent building the center, on the lives transformed, on my own journey from despair to purpose. Standing there, amidst the quiet buzz of everyday life returning to the center, I realized that protection and love sometimes require difficult choices. Showing up, even when it hurts, even when the timing is imperfect, is a form of courage I had come to understand deeply. In those quiet evenings, when the center was still and the lights dimmed, I felt a shift in myself. The past, once heavy and haunting, now felt like soil, ready for something new to grow. Olivia's efforts, though small, reminded me that truth and integrity could coexist with compassion. And Matthew, though shaken, was learning a lesson that would stay with him far longer than any wedding celebration. That family, at its core, is built on trust, honesty, and the willingness to stand for one another, even when it's uncomfortable. As I turned off the lights for the night, I felt a calm satisfaction, knowing that the choices I made had preserved the heart of our family. Love doesn't always arrive in perfect packages. Sometimes it comes wrapped in truth, patience, and resilience. And it is enough to carry us forward. Looking back on everything that happened, I realize how fragile the illusion of perfection can be, and how powerful the quiet strength of truth is. Standing up for what I knew was right wasn't easy. It required patience, courage, and faith in the goodness I hoped my son and Olivia could see. But through it all, I learned that love isn't about avoiding conflict or keeping appearances. Love is about being honest, even when it's uncomfortable, and showing up with integrity when the world expects silence. I think often about the women at the center, about the small victories we celebrate quietly every day. They remind me that transformation doesn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happens slowly, through repeated choices to do right, to be kind, to show up for one another. Olivia's decision to return, to help and to be accountable, felt like that same quiet courage. Redemption doesn't come wrapped in fanfare, it comes in small, consistent acts that rebuild trust over time. Matthew's journey, 2, continues. He is learning that family is more than ceremonies and appearances. It's built on honesty, on shared responsibility, and on the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths with compassion. I hope that, in time, he will carry this lesson into every relationship, understanding that integrity and love are inseparable. And as for me, I've learned that standing firm, even when it's difficult, leaves the heart lighter. The past no longer weighs me down. It has become the soil in which resilience, wisdom, and patience grow. I hope anyone listening to this story remembers that protection, love, and truth are sometimes the most courageous acts we can offer those we care about. If my story resonates with you, or reminds you of someone in your life who has faced a similar challenge, I hope you'll take a moment to like, share, or comment. Sometimes sharing a story is the quietest way to lift someone else's heart, and to remind them that they are never truly alone.